This is Antoine Brown, and we're going to go over a description of quasi-experimental research. What is quasi-experimental research method? Simply put, it's a method in research where the groups for testing are not picked at random, but are pre-existing groups. The characteristics of this method are that you take an already existing group of people as a control group for your experiment and pick a different already existing group of people as a test group for your experiment. This is different from true scientific experimental research method, as they pick theirs at random from larger populations and make the groups themselves artificially. This type of method, the quasi-experimental method, is more useful when dealing with smaller scale research experiments based on schools or organizations rather than research for societies at large. One obvious advantage to this type of method is it's easier to conduct an experiment on an already existing group than it is to go through the time and trouble to make a new group from random people you've selected from a larger population. So it's more expedient this way. An obvious disadvantage to this is there's a far greater risk of selection bias. One group in the experiment may respond to a stimuli differently than another because they had different experiences, or one group may have an advantage in a situation that the other doesn't. Now for the steps for dealing with this method. The first step is to select your research problem. This is the first step for any research method, regardless of type. The second is to plan out your experiment. With your research problem in mind, separate the two groups of people into two different categories, one being your control group and the other being your test group or experiment group. Step 3 is to conduct your experiment. You subject the test or experiment group to the independent variable that only they will be exposed to, while leaving the control group unaffected by the independent variable. Step 4 is to analyze the data. Compare and contrast both groups, and if there's any difference between the way they behave. From there, you can surmise that the independent variable had an effect on the test or experimental group. Step 5 is to publish and present your results. One such example of a quasi-experimental research method is in the article linked to here. It describes an experiment conducted in Oakland, California, where it studied the reactions of different students to having applied technology. Now we discuss quantitative and qualitative data and how they relate to this subject. Quantitative data is more numerical and has to do with the exact amount of something, like, per se, how many people reacted negatively to the independent variable. That's an example of quantitative data, while qualitative data tends to focus more on descriptiveness, like describing how each person reacted to the independent variable. Here you see a chart giving more detail about the differences between quantitative and qualitative data. Here you'll see the references showing the sources I used to make this.